This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I love going in different directions in this podcast, but I especially love the opportunity to really get a chance to dive in with someone who's made a big dent. My guest today, David Cote, has made that dent. Was CEO of Honeywell, Fortune 100 Honeywell, for over a decade. Now, his first book, Winning Now, Winning Later. The whole notion of how does one blend the short-term thinking with the long-term thinking. I've learned over the last 8 or 9 years doing this podcast, when you have a chance to go down the path with somebody who's confident. Now, I'm not saying my other guests are not confident. Most of my guests are very confident. But there's something about those people who achieve at the highest level. There's a certain calmness, a confidence. I don't know how to describe it exactly. My guest today has it. Without any further delay, let's jump right in with David Cote. Speaking of the American dream, I had to go pull up the Honeywell stats tonight just to briefly see where Honeywell sat in the pecking order. And it's right up there in the pecking order. A super successful company that you've had a chance to be a part of for the better part of this century. And your background is pretty dang amazingly average.
Ordinary.
Listen, I don't say that in any disrespectful way.
Believe me, I don't take it that way because I understand.
And look, everybody starts at some level. I mean, maybe some people start up here, they start down here. I saw your commencement speech you gave maybe 8 or 9 years ago.
Oh, thanks.
That was just great. So motivational. And you laid out a lot of what I hope I'll get out of you today, too, because it's such a great story. Here's where I want to start. You are working night shift, factory, airplane parts, college during the day. Who in the blazes makes that sacrifice today?
I don't know. I can't say I see it as often as what I went through because I just had this deathly fear of debt. And it was possible to get student loans back then, too. But I was scared to death of graduating from college. Money was already tight and having to pay a big loan. It just scared me to death. And I figured, well, I'd rather work my way through it than to end up with a bunch of debt when I was done.
Okay, operationally, I'm somebody who likes my sleep. I'll work 18 hours, but I like my sleep. Walk me through the day-to-day of being a young man, 18 to 22 in that range. This had to have been the range of working at night and going to school during the day. How in blazes did that happen?
Well, I got to say, the first couple of years, I did live at school. So it wasn't as intense then, although I had a lot of spare time. School wasn't that hard for me. I was pretty much a screw off in school, too. I didn't attend many classes. And like I said, school was easy for me. When I got to the end of my sophomore year, I was called to the assistant dean of students office, went with my jeans, flannel shirt, and long hair, which was in vogue then. And she told me that I'd no longer be allowed to live on campus. I asked why, what had I done? And she said, well, it's no one big thing. It just seems like wherever you are, there's trouble. You're just a general troublemaker. You could tell I still take some pride in that today, but it caused me to say, okay, I got to do something differently. So I decided, well, I'm sick of having no money. I'm going to start working nights and going to school during the day. That was working okay because I wasn't married yet. When I got to the end of my junior year, I decided to quit school. So I just quit going. And that's why I got a 1.8 that semester and bought a fishing boat with a buddy. I was fishing a couple of days during the week off the coast of Maine, York Harbor, and working nights and then fishing on the weekends. And as you might imagine, that was very tiring. And that was only a few hours of sleep. We quit that and I got married. All of a sudden, we were living in a third floor, unheated, uninsulated apartment in New Hampshire, which means, yes, it was chilly in the winter. My wife came home and said, I'm pregnant and I can't work anymore. And I did this analysis of my earning capacity and realized, despite what people talked about, how the glory days of blue collar jobs, I realized that even with just bare bones spending, I was spending $2 a week more than I was making. And I had $100 in the bank. And I thought, okay, I got 50 weeks to figure out what I'm going to do. And it was an epiphany for me because I was just scared to death that my kid was going to die because I was a screw off. I can remember still that February when he was born, taping up the windows with masking tape because the breeze coming through and I was afraid it was going to hurt him. As tiring as it might be, and it wasn't a lot of sleep, but my life actually got a little easier because instead of doing everything last minute like I used to, I had to plan my whole semester ahead of time and figure out what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. So I'd have papers done 6 weeks before they were due. I walk in and my buddies were talking about the difficulty, how late they were up that night trying to get the paper done. And I'd be sitting there going, geez, this is actually easier. Yeah, there was a little less sleep, but my life actually got easier because I organized it. Very different than what I expected.
So let me put the data point out there again. I think when you left Honeywell, chairman, CEO, but here we are talking about school during the day and a night shift airplane parts. Maybe other people are not so interested in this part of it. I am, because this is the grit. We're in a day and age, and you know this, you've seen everything. We're in a day and age where there's a lot of complaining, there's a lot of finger pointing, personal responsibility is just nowhere to be seen. I mean, of course, with some people it is, but by and large, it's a much different day and age. I love hearing from someone like you who can just map out a completely different experience and cause people perhaps to pause and say, hold on. Maybe what we're hearing in the news and the social media, all this stuff is ridiculous. You just got to do what you got to do. Walk me through getting this night job and what you were doing. Factory floor, airplane parts?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest part of that 2.5 years was running a punch press. 3,000, 7,000 or 8,000 times a night. I'd put a piece of metal in the machine, then hit the buttons, then take the metal out. It was boring as hell. I can promise you that. And because of the epiphany that I just talked about, I also quit smoking cigarettes and started exercising to try to get my life together in an order, realizing, to your point, that I had to take charge here. It's interesting you say that, the way you put it, because I had a discussion with Clarence Thomas once, and he said, we were kind of sharing stories, the Supreme Court Justice, and he said, okay, what if somebody from the government had come to you at that time and said, look, your hard times are not really your fault. Here's a couple $100 a month to help tide you over. What would you have done? I had to sit there and think for a moment and said, I don't know. I really don't know what I would have done. I was sitting there feeling like I didn't have a choice. So I had darn well better get my act together to make this work. It made a big difference for me. I have no idea how I'd have acted if all of a sudden somebody had come to me with a gift of some kind, whether I'd have continued on in the same vein or not. I do know I didn't feel like I had a choice. My family was my responsibility, which my dad used to say when I was a kid, if every man just took care of his own family, the world would be in a much better spot. And that always kind of stuck with me too. Yeah, I just kind of said, I got to take charge of it. There's no one else responsible here but me.
Let me keep it at Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas for a moment. When that happened, I mean, obviously he had a chance to know you a little bit, to know that about you. And for him to kind of throw that across your plate, I suspect you were probably farther along in your career. You had some gravitas behind you at that stage of the game. And so he's asking you that question. When he asked it to you, what was the feeling? I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing by asking you that.
I got to admit, I was a bit befuddled by it because no one had ever put it that way before. I'd never thought of it that way. And it gave me pause. I didn't answer right away. I actually kind of just sat there thinking about it for a little bit, trying to puzzle out what would I have done. And I had to admit to myself that I didn't know. I couldn't just say, oh, I'd done it anyway, or I'd continued to be a screw off. I had to really think about it. And well, 10 years later, I sit here, I still don't really know the answer.
Yeah, you're making me think about it too. I think it really would have come down to what was I currently earning? I mean, because it would have been like one of these gifts that you would think, well, what are the strings attached here? Well, okay, it's just a job. I'll just take it. I'll just take the extra money. And what's the downside? At a young age, you might not really ponder the downside, which is the opportunity cost is the downside.
Well, I think it would have lessened the blow from the kick in the butt that I'd gotten. You would have made me just think a little bit more about, okay, so what are my options here? And procrastination is not the greatest thing when you're that age. Probably not at any age, but it certainly wouldn't have helped me then. Just the fact that all of a sudden I really had to do something just really focused me.
Was there any other lesson from that early night shift job that really kind of stayed with you throughout your career? Was it just the understanding of how all the parts work in a very large operation? So here you are, you eventually get to CEO, chairman, but you've got experience all the way down to the nitty gritty.
Well, actually, there were a huge number of learnings from that job that helped me going forward, more on the how to avoid negatives than anything else. For example, I hated my job. I found it boring as hell. Trying to get through 8 hours a night was, you just did it because you had to. Okay, I got parts, did my job, sent parts out. I had no idea where they came from. I had no idea where they went or how they were used. Nobody ever asked me what I thought about anything. I was just a pair of hands. I had that in mind when we launched the Honeywell operating system, which ended up creating huge benefit for the company because it engaged the thinking of all those folks out on the floor who actually knew how things worked or what the issues were, but really just never had a voice. I also got I'd say a good sense for how people in those positions think about things. And I can remember in my pay envelope once, GE had launched this program called Count on Me. And it was supposed to be this big motivational thing. I open up my envelope and there's this flyer in there about Count on Me. And I read through it and said, okay, I'm in college. I ought to understand this stuff. I couldn't figure it out. So I went and asked one of the older guys, I said, what is this? Am I supposed to do something with this? And he said, this is just the stupid stuff the company does when they've got too much money and they don't want to give it to us in our paycheck. Just throw it away. I said, okay. Well, as you could tell, that stuck with me. So I always avoided all the big motivational programs. We can do it together, altitude limited by attitude, all that kind of stuff. Because I said, yeah, it makes leaders feel good, but it doesn't really do anything. It was the same sort of thing when I can remember they had this quality board that they had put out there. Customer Squawks, it was called. And I spent my break time 2 or 3 nights in a row just spending the 10 minutes looking at that saying, okay, again, I want to go into business. I need a good job someday. I got to understand this thing. I couldn't figure it out. And I asked a foreman who was walking by, I said, hey, could you tell me what this board says? Same thing. He said, nobody knows what this thing means. This is just something the quality guys do to make it sound like they know what they're doing. Oh, okay. So you walk away. It gave me, I guess, a really intense focus on what's practical and what actually works when you deal with people, as opposed to just this big motivational idea that we're going to get everybody together. And I'd say the last one was that I was always very conscious of was there was always discussion amongst higher level people about the stock price. As an employee, I realized none of us cared about that. What we cared about was, were we going to have a job here 5 years later? I'd say, well, the experience was not the most pleasant one, not something I'd want to replicate. At the end of the day, it gave me a really good sense for, okay, how do people who are actually doing the work in a company feel about things and what's important to them? That has been very valuable.
I got to ask you this because I'll forget if I have to come back to it. And this is kind of jumping us up a little bit. I might go back in time with you again. You've got this interesting background. You've got this kind of up from the ground background, work hard background, start at the bottom background. But you eventually get to the highest level of one of the biggest companies in the world. It must have always, I'm guessing, left you with a certain sense that when you would look at a CV, a resume, or you would meet somebody, there had to have been in you a soft spot for people that perhaps had to go through a little bit more grit than just the perfectly coiffed resume. Am I wrong at all? Or
Yeah, I guess there is, you'd have to say, a soft spot there. It never intruded on what I thought was most important, which was somebody's performance. I always used to say when I'd be talking to, say, a staff member who'd be concerned that their kid wasn't going to get into an Ivy League school, and I'd say, geez, as long as somebody goes to like a top 1 or 200 school, don't worry about that. I used to tell people your education gets you your first job. After that, it's all performance. I didn't really care what school they went to. I focused more on, okay, did you do a great job? I can't tell you how many times we'd have discussions in these management resource reviews where you look at people in organizations and stuff. They talk about some person and say their performance is average, but man, they've got great potential. And I'd say, well, potential based on what? Where they went to school, how well they talk about stuff? If that's the case, then I'd say there is no potential. Performance is what matters. If you're not performing in the job you're in, I don't think you're going to perform in a bigger job just because you've got potential. We focused a lot on how well do you perform regardless of background.
we're in GE with the nightly, hourly production work. You stayed at GE until Honeywell?
No, I was with GE for 25 years. Then I went to a company called TRW in Cleveland for about 2.5 years. I eventually became the CEO, then went to Honeywell in February of '02.
Let me keep it at GE for a moment, because that was an interesting period of time for GE. Success, success, success. What are the kinds of big picture lessons you took away from your experience there? One of the things that, look, not many people are going to get the chance to ever run a Fortune 100 company. It's just not in the cards. It's like lightning striking in some ways. What are some of those lessons you can take away from that GE experience that the average person just goes, God, I got behind the scenes listening to David, and that just aha moment?
I don't know that I had an aha moment myself. As you might imagine, I had no big career aspirations. I had no thoughts about what might be possible for me someday. I didn't even think about the idea of becoming a CEO till I was about 40 years old and said, geez, maybe I can do this after all. The things that I'd say did work out for me were I tended to be results oriented. It's just the way I am. And I guess it's one of those things I can't change, good or bad. But that GE environment was very good for people who could perform and who could generate results. And as a result of that, I was able to advance. It was kind of the right environment for me. It didn't have that, while it was a big company, how you came across did matter. But at the end of the day, performance mattered a lot. I'd say the other thing that struck me, I ended up telling a lot of people this same thing, is that if you wanted to advance, you not only had to perform, it had to be visible. Not visible in a way where you were tooting your own horn all the time, but rather somebody of consequence had to see it, somebody who was willing to back you and suggest that you were capable of bigger things. And that visibility mattered. I got a great visibility opportunity when I was 34. I thought it was going to be a disaster. And Jack Welch wrote about this in his book, so it had a impact on him also. But I had this kind of lower level, mid-level kind of finance job. One of my responsibilities was to send out a strategic plan request to all the businesses, the templates they had to fill in for all the financials. And this was 1986. I get a call from Jack Welch asking what seemed like an esoteric question. Dave, is it true we asked Medical Systems for what the ROI will be in the ultrasound business in 1989? And I had to think about it. And I said, yeah, I think we do as part of the strategic plan request. He came through the telephone at me, cursing and yelling and saying he wanted to see it. Now, I brought it up. I had to go into his office, and he just really started continuing yelling and cursing. with me having to explain why we did it. The irony of it was I had recommended to my boss and to his staff, my colleagues, that we not send that out because it was all bureaucratic and we didn't do anything with it. All of a sudden, I'm standing there having to defend it. He told me to leave his office, which I did. And I went to my office, called my wife at the time, and said, geez, I think I've just been fired. I don't know how this works, but I think I've been fired. Advance a couple of months, I end up at this RCA acquisition party because I'd been the finance guy assigned to that team. And I hear across the way, Dave, get over here. And I go walking over and I think, son of a gun, I'm going to get fired at a party. I've heard all the stories about what he's like. I can't believe this is going to happen here. So I go walking over with some trepidation, and my buddy came with me. Jack looked at me and said, you know, Dave, I was never so pissed at anybody since I was in plastics. And I kind of smiled and I said, and I can be a little mouthy sometimes. And I said, well, I really appreciate you sharing it with me. And he thought that was pretty funny. And then my buddy looked at him and said, you know, Jack, Dave never wanted to send out that request in the first place. He recommended against it. We all voted against him and said, no, you had to do it. And I still remember the look on Jack's face as he kind of took his fist and put it to his side, the inside of his fist, and said, wow, so you just took the knife for those guys? I said, well, I didn't really look at it that way. You don't rat on your friends like that. I mean, it's not like it was anything illegal. And he just kept shaking his head and saying, wow, God, man, that's really something. Kind of drifts off, and my buddy and I walk off. And I said to him, geez, that was really nice of you to do. Thank you. And I still remember he said, well, just so we're on the same page here, Dave, if he hadn't been in a good mood, I wouldn't have said anything. We kind of laughed. And later that night, the CFO of the company pulled me aside and said, Dave, you have no idea how much good you've done yourself with everything that's happened here. I said, well, I'm hard pressed to understand how, because it sure hasn't felt like that. And he said, no, Jack was already impressed because he said the way he yelled at you in his office, he'd made vice presidents cry. And you just kind of stood your ground and very respectfully but thoughtfully explained why you did it, even though at the end he said, why would you do such a blank stupid thing? And then when he found out tonight that you hadn't thrown in your friends, he's just incredibly impressed and good things are going to happen to you. Well, it used to be in the company that if you got levels were a big deal then. If you got a 1-level jump, you were doing well. 2-level jump, you were on fire. He had me interviewing for 3 and 4-level jump jobs, one of which I got. Yes, I had the performance. I was a good performer, had been well recognized for that. But that visibility made a big difference. It cuts both ways, because if you don't perform and you're very visible, that's very painful. But I always felt those two go together. You got to perform. Somebody who can do something about it needs to see it.
Okay, but you're downplaying something, I think. What I think you're downplaying is, okay, you got the visibility, but as you just said, other vice presidents he made cry. You had the moxie to stand your ground and not cry. So it's more than just the performance and more than the visibility alone. You also had to have the moxie when you got the moment too.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Yeah. If I had wilted in that conversation, think about it, if I had just started throwing in everybody, that probably wouldn't have turned out so well. Of course, the fact that I didn't throw in anyone at the same time that I didn't wilt, I think really did help, yes.
But now he, a guy who obviously trained a ton of people, very, very famed guy for that, he must have thought, and I don't know, maybe you had further conversations later on in years and whatnot, but there was something he saw, because here's a guy who's seeing lots and lots of people, hundreds, if not thousands. I'm not trying to get you to brag about yourself, but there's something that happened in that moment that I think is really powerful for people to be thinking about when they face their moment in life.
Yeah, I'd say so. The way I've tried to explain it to my own sons is that you got to stand for something. Whatever it is, you don't need to wear it on your sleeve and so on, but you've got to stand for something and know who you are and what you're about. To me, that was more important. I didn't want to be the kind of guy who would wilt like that or run away from trouble if it was something that I needed to handle. I'd say it was more that than anything else. I felt like that's not who I wanted to be or who I was, so I wasn't going to act that way.
Before we shift into Honeywell.
I should add, by the way, Mike, he also did fire me. So,
well, there you go.
when we got to June of 99, I got an invitation to have dinner with him. And he started off the dinner with saying, I want you out of the company by year end. And I was running the major appliance business then. And I said, well, what did you see that you didn't like or didn't see that you wish you had? And his voice just elevated. And he said, you don't understand. You need to be out by year end. And I said, well, I do get it. I'm a big boy, but I think I'm better than you think I am. And if there's something I need to address, I'd like to know what it is. And his voice elevated further, saying, no, you don't understand. You have to be out by year end. And I just said, okay, yep, I get it. Never did find out. So I still don't know exactly why.
Look, I'm the outsider looking in with only so much information, but you did end up going on to become CEO at Honeywell. I don't know if you get too close to the top. And what do they say about the king? If you get too close to the king, I don't know, right? I mean, come on, right? I mean, this people, they got to dig the moat. They got to have a good moat. I don't know what's going on. I'm guessing.
I have not a lot to add there because, like I said, I never did find out. He was, I have to say, always very complimentary after that at Honeywell. Once Honeywell started performing, I'd get a periodic nice note or a Christmas card from him, and it was always very encouraging. He was always very magnanimous about what I'd accomplished.
This is very fun for me as a solo entrepreneur for most of my career. I get to kind of just vicariously live through the corporate experience. Listen, before we shift into Honeywell, because there's some really interesting stories there and the focus of your book that people are going to have to check out, Winning Now, Winning Later, I'm curious. You mentioned your sons. We're in this really crazy day and age, and I mentioned to you that I saw your commencement speech from a few years back. And during that speech, and you kind of brought something up earlier in our conversation, but I want to throw the word out there, entitled. And you talked about that in your commencement speech. I almost wonder, though, in this day and age, in 2020, if the word entitled can literally cause people to think the wrong thing. It seems like we've reached an environment where maybe America is going to be less about merit and performance and talent, and maybe it's going to be about other things.
Yeah, I'm not good enough to know where things are heading. I would say I'm a big believer in personal responsibility, regardless of circumstances. At the end of the day, that's the only thing that really makes a big difference. If you can get some help from people along the way, I'm all in favor of it, and I'd like to think I try to do the same myself. But I used to ask this question of my sons when they were younger, and I'd say, who's the only person in the world responsible for you? They understood the answer was me, as in them. I just wanted them to understand from the beginning that, yes, if people help you, that's great. You should help people whenever you can. But at the end of the day, it's your responsibility to make sure that you succeed, take care of your family, or whatever it is you got to do. Don't spend your time blaming others, even though sometimes others are at fault. Make sure that you understand personal responsibility. Now, I'm not saying personal responsibility to the exclusion of any help from anybody, anywhere, or that circumstances are the same for everyone. But at the end of the day, it's the only one thing you really can count on is yourself. So you don't want to ever lose sight of that.
Maybe in your mind, what you just said sounds simple and straightforward, but I got to tell you, in this day and age, with all the headlines and all the talking and all the voices, it's really nice to hear somebody who has climbed the mountain, started at the bottom, reached the top, and then you just say it so succinctly. This is it. Look in the mirror. We don't live forever, and you got to give it a good shot. Let the chips fall where they may. That's all you can do.
You can't lose sight, I think, of personal responsibility, and that's one that we should talk a lot about. By the same token, though, I'm a big believer that we have to set the stage as best we can so that personal responsibility can take hold. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk about there. One is family values. I'll point out, okay, I was the first in my family to graduate from high school. My dad had 6 months, my mom had 2 days. As my mom has said many times, they couldn't give me a lot of guidance on what to do or how to go about things. I had to figure out stuff myself. But they also just did a great job conveying values. There was love in the family, both of them constantly talking about how we were all going to go to college, that we needed to work hard, all those kinds of things. That was important. The second thing that was important was education. Okay, people can talk about a New Hampshire education. Was it behind? Is it good? Is it bad? But I would say at the end of the day, it was good enough for me to be able to do what I did. And it's one of the things that really concerns me when it comes to what we see in the US today with how big a variability there is in public education systems across the US, which is still largely property tax driven, so that if you're in a poor community, your schooling is probably not going to be as good as if you're in a wealthy community. And that's something that I really think needs to get addressed, because for personal responsibility to take hold and for people to really benefit from that focus on personal responsibility, we've got to give them some of those basic building blocks to be able to do it. And I don't think we do as good a job of that today as we did, say, 40 years ago. I hope I don't sound like just the typical old guy who always talks about how great it was back then. I'm not making that argument. But I am saying we need to give those kind of basic building blocks so that kids have the chance to do the sort of thing I did.
There's no way I can disagree with anything you just said. The only thing I would add to it is that the difference between perhaps when I came along high school in the 80s, you came along a little bit earlier, is that come on, the aging thing doesn't stop. The aging thing doesn't stop for all of us, okay? But here's the thing today that kids today do have the big advantage on me and you. If they feel like they're not getting a good education and they know they're not getting a good education and they want to learn, I mean, MIT is giving free classes online. I know that's not the same thing exactly, but gee whiz. I mean, I wish it would have been really nice to have that. So there's everything you say is true. I'll just add that I think the internet is a game changer.
It could be. But again, I go back to, we'll say, those grammar school years where MIT is not going to be really helpful.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And we don't have a great broadband experience across the 50 states so that kids, no matter where they are, can learn. And I'd say so far the online learning experience has been mixed, as we've seen through the COVID experience. So I'd really like to see a different focus on education in the US and a better understanding that, for example, kids learn differently. I oftentimes say we have an education system designed by elitists for whom the system worked. And we don't really look at, not every kid wants to go to college. And to be told, well, you got to put up with all this kind of baloney learning for 18 years, and then you can go to school to learn what you'd like to. Well, when you get into those years, and I know because mine were a little tumultuous, you're not always thinking about, okay, just 3 more years, 4 more years. You're really thinking, I want to get started now. I want to do something now. And if we could handle grammar school differently, high school differently, to teach kids in a way they want to learn. For example, if a kid is having to learn algebra, painful as that is, because it's just a bunch of formulas, it seems, they're probably not going to pay attention. But if a kid says, I want to be a carpenter, I really like just that whole idea, and you spend your time teaching him algebra in terms of, here's how you build a set of stairs, here's how you calculate the risers, the steps, the distance it's got to carry. Okay, that's math that's usable. I think you'd find that you end up with a much better and different result. We don't even think this way today.
Yeah, you make great points. I mean, I think we're facing a conundrum of issues across the landscape. And have you felt, I mean, I'm not looking for any kind of political view or anything like that, but have you felt a more traumatic time in your life than what we're facing in America right now?
Oh, you got to remember, I lived through the 60s.
Hey, 68, the year I was born, was a little bit of trouble, huh?
It was, I mean, that whole time, I mean, we were a little insulated from it in New Hampshire, as you might imagine, but there were all kinds of discussions about where the hell are things going here. And the world is upside down and we had Vietnam, the riots, the kind of elections that were just seemed nutty at the time, and the polarization. Yes, I have seen a time like this, and I can't say it was good.
Point taken, point taken. By the way, speaking of bandwidth and speaking of Vietnam, I am in Saigon right now.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Or I guess Ho Chi Minh City, as it's now known?
You know, when I first got here, people said that, but eventually it just becomes Saigon. So,
boy, just an amazing place when you look at what's happened there over 40 years. And I'm sure you've seen the activity in the streets as you drive along and you see all the electrical connections on the roads. I don't know how many more wires they can hang on some of those poles.
You see that, you're just like, oh, I want to clean all that up. Hey, okay, listen, I've only got so much time with you. Let me shift into Honeywell. Okay, people are going to have to get the book and dig into more detail, but essentially, you get hired as CEO. And essentially, you show up and they say, and I'm going to let you run with this, you can't see the financials, and it sort of feels like staff and other people there in the office who probably wanted the job too are not really looking to help you very much. And you're thrown into that fire? Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah. It was all stuff I kept in mind when I went through my own transition to my successor, who, as you've probably noticed, is doing a fabulous job. I don't think a transition could have been handled much worse than that one was. I'm the CEO, and for the first 4.5 months, I'm told not to look at the financials, to just focus on learning the businesses, which seemed like a reasonable thought at the time. I thought it was a little odd, but not a big enough thing to make a big deal out of. But then when I would ask a finance guy, just a typical how's the quarter going, they would say, I'm sorry, Dave, but I've been instructed not to answer any of those questions from you. Okay.
That's a little unusual.
Yeah, this is a little different. All of a sudden, I become chairman. I can see the numbers, start interacting with everybody. 3 people on my staff had either interviewed or expressed interest in my job. So that was a interesting dynamic to deal with. When I realized the extent of the issues that we had to deal with, the aggressive accounting, the unrecognized environmental, asbestos, and pension liabilities, I said, oh man, okay, I just got to buckle down, I guess, and figure this thing out. Discussed it with the board and then was pulled aside by kind of, let's say, an acting lead director at the end of the meeting saying, Dave, we don't want to hear about any of that stuff at the board. As far as we're concerned, that's just your responsibility to run the company. Whatever it is, you figure it out. Okay.
Oversight was not that much oversight.
No, at that point, I realized I have a board I can't trust and I have a staff I can't trust. So I've got to really start thinking differently about how to get things done. Interestingly, it actually made me a better leader because you always start as an individual contributor where you have to advocate, analyze, all that kind of stuff, and have a point of view. Well, the higher you go up in leadership, the more you start to realize that there's no way you can know everything. Whatever the issue is, you're just not going to know everything. You have to start figuring out, how do I get all the facts and the opinions so that I can make a good decision? I couldn't just do it the way I used to, where you say, okay, here's the issue, here's what I think we ought to do, what do you think? Because on my staff, for example, there were a bunch of guys who really weren't interested in my success because they thought they should have my job. So I had to do things differently. And I came up with this approach, and the way I've labeled it was that as a leader, I needed to be right at the end of the meeting, not at the beginning of the meeting. And that caused me to just run meetings very differently, which I've described in the book, where I wouldn't let people know what I was thinking at the beginning. I would go out of my way to support people who might say something that was contrary to whatever I was thinking, and then making sure that I heard from every single person at the table, whether they were an introvert or an extrovert, because as you probably know, they participate differently. And then when I got to the end of the meeting, I would start with the most junior person in the room and say, what do you think I should do? And of course, it's always fun in the beginning because the first thing they do is look at their boss, and their boss goes to respond. And I'd say, no, I'll get to you. I want to know what so-and-so thinks. And I'd work my way around the table from the most junior to the most senior person in the room. And only when I had all that would I then make a decision and I'd explain it. I'd explain it because I wanted people to learn how I was thinking about stuff and why I'd made the decision I did, but also because for those people for whom the decision did not go with what they had recommended, I wanted them to understand that, yes, I had listened. I just didn't agree with what they said. And there's a tendency amongst people, if you make a decision contrary to what they said, to say, well, he's not listening, when there's really a big difference between listening and agreeing. And by taking the time to explain it, I hope to increase the odds that people would say, okay, he does listen. I should participate in meetings to make sure he hears what I have to say. He just didn't agree with me. That whole process just made me a better leader because I made better decisions. And as I used to tell people in training classes, as a leader, you don't get measured on whether something was your idea or not. You get measured on, did you make a good decision that benefited the organization? And if you approach it that way, approach your leadership job that way, you run your meetings very differently. You make your decisions differently.
You wanted transparency.
Absolutely. It's why I traveled as much as I did. I spent 500-600 hours a year on the plane. That's 23 straight days a year, 24 hours a day, visiting customers, employees, doing town halls, visited over 100 countries during the time I was the CEO, just because I wanted to get a handle on what was going on out there, what were people thinking, was stuff working, just had to get a handle on it so that I could make good decisions and make sure the decisions I'd made were working.
Just a complete side tangent. I had a chance tonight before we started chatting to do a little deep dive on the history of Honeywell back to inception, the original company that was not called Honeywell, and the merger, the early merger, I guess in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Fascinating to go back and think about the history, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I've got to admit, I didn't know a lot about it myself. I've only read snippets here and there, but for me, it really supports this whole idea that I talk about, and that's that people, organizations, countries, whatever it is, they have to evolve. Whatever you were doing that was successful 2 years ago, you need to keep evolving because everything around you is constantly changing. And if you don't evolve as a person or an organization, a company, a country, whatever, then at some point you fall behind. And the only reason we've been able to continue to be successful is because we keep evolving and we continue evolving under my successor, which I can tell you gives me no end of pride and joy seeing the company continue to do well.
This next question, your answer is actually your book, so it would be a very long answer if we got the full, complete answer. When I look at that title, Winning Now, Winning Later, this is a really tough issue for so many companies in the public eye this day and age. You've got this pressure. You've got all these suits and talking heads who often don't know what they're talking about on CNBC nonstop. CNBC America, CNBC Asia, CNBC Europe, they just keep running. It never stops. And then you've got the fund managers. I think I saw one speech where you talked about Fidelity supported you, but a lot of people really weren't that eager to support and whatnot. So you got all these, one side of the equation, the short-termers, the quarterly people looking to measure you by the quarter. If you don't do this. But on the flip side, you just laid out why, if you only focus on that, you're screwed because you got to focus on what's coming next in the 5, 10, 15-year windows as well.
Well, the point I try to make is that you have to do both. There's this concept that I like a lot that, in fact, there are still people who repeat it in the company, that success is about achieving two seemingly conflicting things at the same time. And as human beings, we always want to know, okay, what's the one thing you want me to do, boss? My point is, it's never just one thing. There's always kind of this other thing that seems to be in conflict, but has to be done at the same time. I have a bunch of examples, and you can always think of more, but do you want low inventory or do you want great customer delivery? Do you want low functional staff costs or do you want great internal service? Do you want people closest to the action empowered for quick decisions, or do you want good control so nothing bad happens? Do you want good short term results, or do you want good long term results? In every case, you want both. And the trick is to figure out, how do you do that? If we take a look at Honeywell's performance, for example, we did outperform in the short term, in addition to way outperforming in the long term. And in the short term, I did have to answer questions along the lines of, well, yes, you're outperforming, but why isn't it better than it is, given how some of the financials are going? And I used to continue to answer, look, we have an empty pipeline, products, services, geographies, process work. I got to fill that pipeline until I get that seed planting done so that it starts to pay off. We're never going to be everything we could be. So the whole book is about, how did we accomplish both at Honeywell so that we gave investors enough in the short term so that they didn't abandon us, but at the same time did the seed planting that was necessary to have a great long term. And the thing I dislike about all the short-termism discussions out there now is they make it sound like it's mutually exclusive. You are either one or the other. And the point I try to make is you have to do both. We use Honeywell in the book as an example of, how do you accomplish both? What are some ways to do that? And it covers, first, banishing your own intellectual laziness, then starting to look at process. How do you hold fixed costs constant and grow sales? What do you do about culture? What do you do about leadership? How do you handle transition or recession, et cetera? And really try to make it more of a how-to.
Yeah, people are going to have to do the deep dive in. When I get someone like you on the horn here, I just want to kind of probe you for all kinds of interesting stuff that I don't necessarily know that is even there yet. I'm kind of fishing, you know what I mean? And I tell you, here's the fishing that I would like to go for. Since you brought up Clarence Thomas, you brought up Jack Welch, I'm sure there's somebody else that you could bring up. Who is the mentor, the piece of insight? I mean, you had this lengthy career. I mean, basically a legendary type career. Give me some moment, some mentor, something that happened along the way. I mean, I'm out there on the side of the river right now fishing. I don't even know what's out there, but I know there's something out there that's really interesting that you want to tell me and the audience about.
Well, I don't know that I've got an exciting answer there, because I never had a, say, career-long or 10-year-long mentor that I always turned to. I did have a lot of people along the way who did help, though, getting back to that visibility and people helping you, where I performed really well for them. They liked me, and they were very helpful in terms of my next step. That started early in my career, actually even before then, I guess. And I'm a big believer in second chances. If somebody is contrite about whatever happened or they could have done differently. And I've benefited from that, and I've tried to help people in the same way. But in terms of just a different way of saying it, is I've been asked many times in the past, okay, who is the biggest influence on your leadership style? And they all expect me to name a famous CEO. And I always say the same thing: my mom and dad. The stuff that they taught me when I was a kid, just kind of imparting the kind of values that we talked about. For example, independent thinking. And I'm fond of saying independent thinking is a lot more rare than being smart. And I think all the times my dad would say, be a leader, not a follower. And my mom saying, think for yourself. Irritating to hear as a kid. But over time, you realize how important it was in terms of developing the things that were actually going to be helpful to me.
I like your calm style, but I'm curious, as you tell the story of Jack Welch earlier, not so calm in some moments with you. Talk about your management style. Did you ever take any of that intensity behind the scenes with staff, or were you more of the kind of guy that I'm talking to right now?
Oh, I think people would say that I definitely had an intensity about performance, and that people understood whatever relationship I had with them was determined based on performance. We could get along fine and have family discussions and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, they all knew they needed to deliver, and that never did change. All that being said, I always felt, going back to mom and dad lessons, that you can be demanding without being a twit about it. You don't have to yell and scream. And I always said I responded better if somebody said, "Would you please pick up that book for me?" as opposed to, "Dave, pick up that book." It's just a different way of conveying what your expectations are. You can be nice about it and still be demanding. And I think most people would say I was very demanding, but I'd like to think that they would say I wasn't a twit about it either.
Dave, thank you for taking some time today. The book, Winning Now, Winning Later, How Companies Can Succeed in the Short Term While Investing for the Long Term. People will have to go dig in. I didn't try to do you a table of contents read through. I just felt like if I'm gonna have you on the phone, I want to pull that personality out of you. And then at the end, when people like you, they say, well, gosh, I'm going to buy this guy's book because he was really interesting. That's the name of the game.
I really worked hard. I oftentimes said most business books would make great pamphlets. It's 10 pages of useful concept and 250 pages of stories that say the same thing. And I wanted to do something that was just a lot more substantive and that every page would have something that someone could probably glean that would help them to perform better, help their organization perform better. And I'm very encouraged by the reception so far. As you probably saw, Fortune wrote a great review of it, and Hank Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, Goldman Sachs CEO, said publicly last week that it was the best business book he had read in his life. I feel very good about the substance of what's in there, and I hope people feel the same way.
Good stuff. I appreciate it. Congratulations. Hope all goes well. People need to get out there and start buying books now. Beyond Amazon, is there any kind of a book website you want to touch on or anything like that, or just go buy the book at Amazon?
It is available in a bunch of different places, and I'd say Amazon is where I go generally, so I assume everybody else does too.
Hey, David, I appreciate you coming on again. Thanks a lot.
Happy to do it, and it was fun, Mike. Thanks.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.